Right, everybody. Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for another Control+M Presents session. We'll be recording today's session, so I'm putting everyone on mute as they join. And of course, when we're done here, I will be posting this to our YouTube page. So today is part 2 of our session, Learning to Love MRP and PRP. And today we're going to focus on PRP. I want to thank everyone for understanding on splitting these 2 sessions up. As we went through the practice sessions, it just 1 hour wasn't long enough to discuss everything I wanted to share with you. So today we're going to do a basic overview from last week, then we're going to dig deeper into some PRP concepts. There might be some topics that you want to add. If you do, keep a list of questions handy. And if you want to request sessions at the end of this session or any additional planning engine related topics, we'll be happy to do that as time allows. Just one caveat, please know that due to the short length of the session, we're not going to be able to diagnose specific MRP issues, but you can always reach out to me or put a case into Plex if you have specific questions. We have a number of food and beverage customers on the call, as well as Plex discrete customers. So please know that when I say the word part, I mean item in food and bev. In metals or discrete manufacturing, parts are things we buy, inventory, make, or sell to a customer, and items are supply items. But in food and beverage PCN, things that we know as parts are called items. So, and routings are called formulas. So I apologize. I mostly work in discrete, so I'll try to remember to say part or item on routings or formulas, but please forgive me if I do mess up on that. Thanks. So what we're doing today is building on what we saw last week in MRP, and I want to thank everyone who came to that session. But if you missed it, please check it out on our YouTube channel. Even if you missed last week's session, the session's still going to benefit you. And every email that comes from anybody at Control+M has a link to our YouTube channel. The MRP session is out there along with all of our other video presentations. We'd be flattered if you check us out, maybe subscribe and like our content. One other quick word of warning, nothing we discussed today can really be construed as a recommendation to change what you're doing. It's all being shown you to teach you how the system works so that you can troubleshoot yours better and make good decisions. As with anything in Plex, once you see how it works, just test until you're comfortable that you got the results that you want to have. So both MRP and PRP are built on a really powerful engine using the same mathematical calculations. Since we're focusing on PRP, the math is as follows: inventory plus what's being built by jobs minus what we need to use up either by consuming into another job or shipping to a customer. And this equals our net position. And we view that down in buckets by days or weeks. We're going to start out with some basic PRP concepts to make sure we're on the same page and then dive deeper. There's so much that goes on with these engines. And if you don't know how I got into it, I'll tell you so that you can do it as well. I was once a Plex customer, and when my company purchased Plex, we had a scheduling person who just didn't believe what MRP and PRP were telling her. And there wasn't a week that went by that she wasn't at my desk telling me Plex is broken, it's double dipping. And without fail, every single time I reversed engineered her examples, I found out she was lying to the system. Now, you've probably heard me say this before. Plex is like your mother, and if you lie to her, she's going to know, and you're going to pay the price. So we'll go through a few slides, and I'll show you what I learned while in the process of reverse engineering MRP, PRP, and let you know that you can do it too. So I'm going to show you how you might be lying to Plex, and if you are, how to stop it. So what are some of the demand drivers and date drivers in PRP? Well, of course, the most common driver is customer orders, but those quantities are factored in along with min inventory, min job quantity, standard job quantity, job start dates, part lead times. These are just a few of the items that impact and drive PRP, just like MRP. One of the things we often talk about is job standard quantity, and there's a setting out there called job demand standard quantity use. Now, standard job quantities are typically a pretty heated argument in companies. Presidents and people who care a lot about costing love it because it's supposed to represent the economic build quantity that gets you the most effective setup cost peanut butter to cross parts. But sometimes materials and ops guys argue against it. They say, why make a whole standard job size if all we need is a few parts? Well, these are generally in there to maximize or minimize part setup cost. So let's say, for example, you have a job that has an expected setup time of 2 hours and a standard job quantity of 1,200 pieces. Your company then expects that each part will absorb about 6 seconds of setup time per part. So 1,200 pieces into 120 minutes is about 6 seconds. But if we make only 120 parts, we're still going to have that same 120-minute setup time, which means we're going to have 10 times the setup time allocated to each part. In reality, anytime you make less than a standard job quantity, it means you're going to have a higher actual cost per part if you incur setup. Now, I understand the argument, and I could take either side in a debate. What's important here is this. If you have standard job quantities and you don't typically produce in those standard job quantities, then you might not want to have your planning engines pay attention to them. Now, moving on, there is a setting called job usage that can have jobs either drive demand or be ignored completely or just be used for visibility. I have one client who just uses them as a reference, and I've seen a few legitimate reasons for this, but they're very unique. The reason I'm telling you about this is not to recommend that you turn it on, but if you're curious about why your production jobs are not being included in the math calculations, check this setting to see why. Forecasts can drive in demand or just be visible, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail later on. And remember, like MRP, requirements in PRP show up when the items are needed, not when to start the job. Plex will calculate your job start date by working backwards from the due date. If you're on infinite scheduling, it might change it a little bit if you're using finite. So remember, it tells us when we need things done, not when to start them. PRP shows customer orders as demand on the date that they need to ship out. Now, depending on the flags, of course, for the PO status, as well as release type and release status. And that subtracts built-in lead times or transport days. So, for example, if your customer needs parts in their hands on a Wednesday and they have a 2-day transport lead time on the part, Plex is going to advise you to have that job completed on Monday. But before jobs are created, Plex is going to drive subassembly or component requirement due dates by the part lead time at the upper part level. We'll see that in a few minutes. PRP also uses jobs and routing times on those jobs to make sure things are done on time. Once all jobs are created, components and subassemblies are due the day that the consuming operation is going to start. That's when it's going to need them, just like MRP. And PRP uses the job BOM over the part BOM once the job has been created. We're going to talk a little bit about min inventories and actually see some of those in person, but remember, know that you can run those by building, which we'll dig into, and know that minimum inventory levels do add up, and we'll see that in a few minutes. I'd like to invite everyone here to take a screenshot of this for troubleshooting. These are setup tables that can impact PRP. And I had a similar table in the MRP session, and thanks, Jill, for putting that direct link out there. All these setup tables have the ability to either include or not be included in the MRP PRP visibility and calculations. Some of them will have 2 checkboxes, like the setup table I have here for customer release status, visible in both MRP and PRP. Some of them break them out separately, but if you only see a flag that says include in MRP, first hit the maintenance button on the setup table to see if that's possible to add it. And if it's not, generally, if you only see include in MRP, it means include in both. So if you're seeing results you don't understand, make sure to check these setup tables. A big driver for PRP, just like MRP, is inventory. Yours needs to be accurate for anything to work reliably in Plex. So make sure that you're doing cycle counts and you have accurate inventory counts in your system. And remember, we can sometimes include or exclude container status codes from both MRP and PRP. For example, we would not want to consider shipped inventory as available, right? It's already gone. And if you're thinking about consignment inventory, then I'm sorry, you're just thinking too deep there. Regarding inventory that's potentially not good. So remember in Plex, defective inventory is a temporary condition. It's either something that's going to be reworked and made good or scrapped and thrown in the garbage. Inventory that can be considered potentially not good is driven by the rework flag on the container status setup table. Note the setting that shows it here has a little bit of a warning on it. And whenever I see a setting that has a warning, I take it very seriously. This rework inventory display setting breaks out rework inventory into its own separate column. But remember here, when the setting is set to 2, which means included in the math, and the container status has the flag included, it'll count as inventory twice. So make sure that you understand exactly what that is doing. So note on this screenshot, I'm breaking out WIP and finished goods as well as rework inventory. So when I click on the 15 or the 10 above, I'm going to see all 27 pieces of inventory, because whether or not that inventory is included in the math, those hyperlinks take you to the inventory screen, which will automatically show you all inventory. So this setting basically says either hide it or show it, but show it and don't include it, or show it and include it. So make sure you figure out exactly what you want that inventory to do, and then test the setting and run it by the people using PRP, because you might be a real positive person and think rework inventory is going to turn out great. Somebody else might be a little bit less positive and think it's not going to be good. So buildings can be very powerful in PRP and MRP, but they do require discipline. I once worked with a metal stamping client who had 2 plants that were about 40 miles apart, but they didn't have buildings set up for inventory. They had one PCN. So their planning engine could see a steel coil that was 40 miles away as available source material for a work center. And obviously that caused some issues because Plex didn't understand that 40 miles was too far for a forklift to drive it. Now, it's not a difficult fix. We just set up inventory by buildings. But it's important to note that every part has to have a building in order for the planning engines to work correctly. And if you forget, and then somebody filters PRP by buildings only, you might miss a part. So imagine this, you have 2 planners, one for your building in Detroit and the other one for your building in Troy. And one or more important parts or sub-assemblies has no such building defined. Well, nobody would go looking for it because they're only looking for parts in Detroit or parts in Troy. So you have to be very careful about this. If you do decide to do inventory by buildings, decide if you need a single building or if you want to have multiple buildings set up per part. Now, if you have multiple buildings set up, you can have the functionality of min and max inventory by building. But then you also have to get deeper into that, for example, buildings for sales orders and buildings for jobs. So we probably could do a separate session on that if anyone was interested in managing Plex by buildings. Just know what you can do and what the limitations are. So PRP can also tell you where you're short and have excess material like in MRP, but there aren't any sexy pull downs for PRP with mins and requirements like there are for MRP. Just yes or no, don't show them to me, right? But you can define some variables with the settings that are on the screen here. So this, for example, might say requirements only exclude the schedule, is not going to include jobs that are scheduled. So keep in mind, if these settings are on, these are things that you're going to want to look at to say, how's PRP behaving? Is it telling me what we want to know? So take a screenshot of this if you want to as well, to take a peek at those, whether they're on or not, and whether they should be or not. For example, in this case, requirements only includes below min inventory. I typically like to have that on for my customers. There's a reason that you're setting up min inventory. So if yours are not showing up, check that setting. So you can select PRP in buckets of days or weeks. I typically advise schedulers to look at their PRP first in days, like every day they should look at for the next couple of days to see if either any new demand snuck in, or maybe there was a number of non-conforming parts or scrap made yesterday. Then look by weeks for longer range planning. And also you should know that there is a setting called the days bucket limit, which can be set to more than 52. So in MRP, I believe that our max days is 52, even though you can put a bigger number in. In PRP, you can send it out to be more than 52 days with this days bucket limit setting. So there are a number of useful filters on PRP, like planning group and part group, and some you can hide, others that you can't hide. If you're running through PRP by primary customer, you should know that this is the first active customer part. It works best if you only have one customer per part, but Plex was made for so much more greatness. We don't really see many people using that, so they like to turn that off. Same thing with primary work center. It's seldom used. It's not picking the first work center on the routing. It's at work center at the part level, which is typically turned off. So we like to turn off that filter. If you hide filters that you're not using, it just becomes less confusing, and it gives you more screen real estate to actually see the data that you're looking at. Let's talk about some related parts on here. So we're going to be going through in quite detail about a number of parts here, but the related parts basically can be filtered to show parts that are related on the PRP grid. And it can be very verbose. So we're going to take a peek at Plex and check out the settings with the words that say related parts in them. And there are different ways to show it here. So let's just go into live and make some changes, or make some peeks at this setting. So right now we're in PRP right now, and we're searching by a part group of PRP training. And we're going to look at the settings here for related parts all display. Right now the setting is set to 2, which means show the components and upstream inventory items here. And we'll see on here that for my apple pie filling, it goes into the apple pie, but it's also made out of flour, sugar, and apples. And in my apple pie here, you can see all the BOM components used, and you'll see flour in there twice because we have flour in the apple pie filling and we have flour in our dough. Now, if I change this related parts to 3, it's only going to show my components here on there. So it's going to make things a little easier. When I click search here, I'm not going to expect to see the apple pie under apple pie filling because I haven't shown the upstream part. So this is a fun way to look at Plex, and it also can interact with the filter screen or the filter area where you can tell Plex what to look for filters, whether or not you just want to see components or finished good items. Generally, when we see people running by finished goods on the PRP filter, it's because they want to run it by a finished good part and see all the components that combine to the finished good parts. But you can do it both ways here, by subassembly or finished good part. So there's a few gotchas in PRP. First of all, if you have a manufactured part operation on a routing without a work center, the part's just not going to show up on PRP, even if you have the setting called subcontract parts display on. That setting specifically states this: when turned on, parts that are only subcontracted are displayed as well. Otherwise, only parts that have an approved work center are displayed. But that's only for external operations. If you have an internal operation with no work center, the part isn't going to show up. So I'm going to show you exactly what this means here by looking at a part that we created specifically for this. I created a part called manufactured part with no work center but supplier, and the primary function is approved work centers. And now when I look at this part in PRP, nothing happens. It acts as though it doesn't really understand this part at all. I have an approved supplier on this, which is silly because it's not an outside operation. But once I put an approved work center on here, and I can pick any one, I'll just put this on a drill press. Once I click OK, and this has got a work center on it, now PRP is going to see this part and show me what I should be doing with it, if anything. So remember, even if this setting is on the subcontract parts display, if you don't have a work center on your part, it's not going to show up. So we want to make sure that we have all parts that have work centers, and we're going to see some reports in the coming slides that are going to make some errors stick out. Well, how are job due dates and quantities pulled over to the create screen? Well, what happens when we click on create on this red create, we're going to create a job for the quantity that's in this red area on the date that's in that particular bucket cap. So if I clicked by the lower star of 90 and I'm going to create a I'm going to create a job for 90 breakfasts due April 27th. Now, this is in day buckets, but if you're in week buckets and your weeks start on Sunday, lots of people get cranky because their buckets start on Sunday, which means all their jobs are starting on Sunday, and that's not typically good if you're just Monday through Friday. So there's a setting out there called recommendation week begins. We generally set that to 2 for Monday. I've also got 2 other items turned on the screen, which is future scheduled. That tells me that I have 21 pieces scheduled out in the future that I can't see here. And this is one of my favorites, window time, use max part lead time. So if we look close at this particular screen, you can see that I have a window of, I've asked Plex for a window of 4 days here, but clearly I've got way more than 4 days. I've got a lead time of 7 days on this part. So Plex is saying to me, look, you're only looking at 4 days, but you're going to be in trouble because this guy has demand within more than 4 days. So it's showing me all 7. Now you might be asking yourself, this is more like 10 or 11 days. Why is it 10 or 11? It's not taking 7 plus 4. I ran this with multiple parts out there, and one of the parts had an 11-day lead time. So again, the best practice in a daily PRP review is when you first get in the morning, look at PRP in daily buckets to see anything that may have fallen in, then run it in longer term buckets for the longer term planning. So we're going to talk about what an MRP gen is. An MRP generation works for both the MRP and the PRP logic. Folks that have been on Plex for a very long time remember that there used to only be a few generations a day. And if we wanted test generated, we actually had to pick up the phone, call Plex, and beg somebody there to gen it for us. Well, thankfully, those days are gone. So we can generate this ourselves as well as schedule generations ourselves by clicking on the MRP admin button. And I'll show this screen in Classic on the next. And we can either generate MRP for immediate gratification for making it right away, or click the add button to put a new generation onto this list here. As you can see, I'm generating MRP twice a day at 1 a.m. and 11 p.m. Not particularly useful for a production PCN. We typically do 7 a.m., 11 a.m., and 3 p.m., depending on your working hours, so that when you come in, MRP is fresh. It refreshes twice in the middle of the day. So in Classic, this is pretty much the same. MRP gives me immediate gratification of running it. Add means put another one onto the schedule. The most important thing that this generation does is recalculate net demand or parent demand. And parent demand or net demand is probably the #1 thing that we get requested information about, that everybody wants to know what is it. So it's generally the same in PRP as MRP in the respect that it's unmet demand. If you came to the session last week, this is going to be a little bit of review, but having said that, you can never review parent demand too much. So net demand basically works the same in both engines. It's unmet demand. It's demand that the system sees, but we haven't fully accounted for. And net demand is often glossarized. Why is that, people ask? Well, if you have net in there and net demand, it can be confusing. So I'm going to jump out and imagine if we were looking at this and this said net demand forecast, net demand job, net demand, and net. That just gets confusing to people. So we glossarize that to say parent demand. It's one of the few times I think it's pretty universal, because almost any implementation done by Plex or us is going to have that glossarization out there. So performing a regen in MRP recalcs the net demand, but net demand is also reduced in real time if you're making a job to fulfill net demand so that it doesn't double up. Now that's also an oldie. It used to be that you had to regen to make those jobs apply, but Plex changed this back in about 2012 that jobs automatically eliminate net when they're created. Now Plex is going to add up demand and it's going to show you how to manage it. So let's say, for example, that you're making pies and you make pie dough as a subassembly for pies, and you make multiple types of pies. If you have orders for or minimum inventory at your pies, they're each going to add up together to drive demand for the dough. Plex is going to show you demand for the pie shipment as potentially two lines, one for the crust, which is a subassembly, and one for the filling, which is a subassembly. And the best place to see that is to look at the demand details on the net demand line. And you might want to look at the exploded bill of material on the parts, which we looked at in the MRP session. So go ahead and watch that to see the exploded BOM. And then, match up your quantities to see which subassemblies are driving demand. Again, this is the number one topic we get asked for. So we're going to go through some real life sort of explanations of this. We set up a part in our system for apple pie and one for cherry pie. We also set up a part for dough, which is made up of components of lard, sugar, salt, and flour. And the dough is added to apple pie filling to make an apple pie, and it's added to cherry pie filling to make a cherry pie. On the dough, we've got a minimum inventory of 10 pounds and a standard job quantity of 15 pounds. Now, I realize that in reality, that makes very little sense. You typically would have your minimum inventory be a multiple of your standard job quantity or vice versa, but it makes it easier for me to have conversations with you if the numbers don't all sort of add up in unique ways. It's like I never like to say 5 of one and 5 of another. If I'm looking at a quantity of 10, I want to say 7 and 3 or 6 and 4 so I can see which number is my driver. If I split things exactly in half, it's more difficult to see which the driver is. So each dough and each pie filling have a min inventory of 10 pounds, and the dough has a standard job quantity of 15, and the pie is made up of subassemblies of pie filling and dough. So the first example that we're going to cover is not only going to cover the net demand generated by these examples, but in addition, the additive properties of all the minimum inventories, because they add up really fast, and that it's going to peanut butter in the standard job quantity factor as well. So the interesting thing here is each of these items is a 10 pound or 10 pie minimum, and we have standard job sizes of 15. And right now we're going to have 0 customer demand, and I have generated Plex. So let's go see it in live. I think I can get rid of these 2 sessions here. All right. So this is our demand in live. If we look at the apple pie part, it says we have a minimum inventory of 10 pieces. But if we look at the apple pie filling, we have a parent demand of 45. Now, why is that? Well, the first thing we're going to need to know is we have a BOM quantity of 3. 3 pounds of apple pie filling goes into a pie. We can see that here in our BOM quantity in 3. Now, the first thing you're probably going to notice here is if the minimum inventory for an apple pie is 10, why is Plex telling me that a minimum inventory is 15? So we only need 10 apple pies and 10 cherry pies, but the minimum is 15. The reason is in order to fulfill my min inventory of 10 pieces, Plex says we're going to need to create a job. And since we typically create a standard job quantity in quantities of 15, we're probably going to make 15. So some people look at that and they feel that it's misleading, but in reality, it's not. PRP is saying, look, you have to hit your min inventory level. And when you do, you told me that you like to make this in groups of 15. So you're probably going to make 15 to hit your minimum inventory. And it's in the current week. So we want to get this in the current week, but we needed this filling a week ago. So where does this due date of a week ago? This is 10/12. So we are past due on the parent demand for apple pie filling. And we have the same condition for cherry pie. And this time we only use 2 pounds of filling. But again, my min inventory, even though it's 10, I have a standard job quantity of 15. This one is not needed a week early. The reason is this: there is a part lead time on the apple pie, the high level part. So in apple pie, in the parts section here, I've told Plex it takes me a week to make an apple pie. Now, if it takes me a week to make an apple pie and my min inventory today is 10, I needed the pie filling a week ago for that. But my cherry pie, I'm telling you that I can make in 1 day. That means there's no part lead time on here. So it's saying, hey, you should fill your min inventory, but you can do it today if you want, because you can make these pies in a day. So hopefully that makes some sense. All right, moving on. Let's talk about net demand job. Net demand job means that there's a job that's going to consume some sub-assembly. So let's go see it in real life. We're going to create a job for 24 apple pies. It's going to be due November 9th. And it's going to factor in the minimum inventory, the standard job size. And let's see what happens. We're going to generate this job for pie on November 9th. And then we're going to look at the filling. All right. So we're going to do this by saying, I want a job on November 9th. And I'm doing, these are kind of silly numbers. MRP is not recommending this to me, but I'm doing it because I want to make things lay out a little bit more in the future. To create jobs in PRP, I simply have to click on the net line. Excuse me. To create jobs in PRP, I simply have to click on the net line, and Plex will create a job for the desired quantity as a multiple of standard jobs and the date at the top of the bucket. So I'm going to click here, and I expect it to create a standard job quantity of 15 for a due date of November 7th. Now I'm selecting to change my quantity to 24, and I'm going to change this to the 9th. Now, if you know this little trick, great. If you don't, if you hit the plus key while you're in the field of the due date, it can go up by a day. If you click minus, it'll go down by a day. So I'm going to have a job for 24 pies made November 9th and click OK. And you'll see here now that I have no demand. I have a standard job quantity of 15, min inventory of 10, and now I have my scheduled job for 24 pieces. I'm going to generate MRP because I want to see net demand, and it can take up to 5 minutes to run MRP, and I don't want to wait a full 5 minutes in this session. So what we're going to see here now is we have our job demand here, which remember is 72 because we have 3 pounds of apple pie filling. This job here is 24 pies. This job demand here of 72 pieces is telling me that it's coming from job number 163. That has a due date of 11/7, which is going to be my start date on that apple pie. Now let's keep going here. When you see a screen up here that says MRP generation in process, don't trust any numbers, just wait till it's done. And now we're going to see that as we scroll down here, we've got some job demand for pie. Okay, so we've got that good job demand here. And all right. Now, the other net demand that we want to cover here is, let's say the customer places an order for a pie on Monday, and you're at max capacity on Monday. So you create the pie job for Wednesday. Plex is going to show net demand for the order that's been entered as well as the job that's created. And the reason is we can't ship a pie out on Monday that isn't made until Wednesday. So Plex says, I don't care why you're making this on Wednesday, but you need some on Monday. I'm gonna force you to buy enough material for 2. So let's set up that condition. I've taken the liberty of putting in a customer release for this, and I changed the release status to canceled. I'm just going to reactivate this release status here, and I'm going to say on November 7th, I want those 24 pies, and I'm going to tell Plex this release is open. So now when we look at this, we'll regen MRP again. You can see it tells me whenever it regens, but I've made changes since then. And I can make as many manual generations as I want. You'll see in here that I've been making them all morning as I've been testing. So on here now, the generation's been entered. The last time I ran it was 12:35. It's now 12:36. And we're going to see how some of these, are actually, sorry, my PowerPoint went down. Slideshow. There we go. So we're going to see how some of these actually are going to drive what looks like doubling demand. So let's see if my generation has completed. Completed at 12:37. It looks to me like we have customer releases in this bucket, customer scheduled in this bucket. Everything looks great. But when I look at the apple pie filling, I see my job demand is still 72 for that job 163 that I created up here, but I'm also seeing parent demand at apple pie filling. And Plex is saying, look, you've got a ship schedule of 30 pieces that's due 10/31. And I've got to have this by 10/31 to make the pie by 11/7. So remember, even though my order is only for 24, because I don't have a job to fulfill that 24 yet, Plex is wanting multiples of the standard job quantity. And people call us all the time and say this, why does Plex want more even though I'm making it that week. And let me show you why by switching to days. I'm going to switch my PRP to 28 days. And what you're going to see here is between 11.7 and 11.9, we actually do go negative. So here Plex is saying, look, I need pies on the 7th, and I'm not making them till the 9th. Now, I don't know why we're making them on the 9th, and I don't care why we're making them on the 9th. Here's my job demand for the 9th. But in order to be successful to ship on Monday the 7th, I've got to have a job done by Monday the 7th. And that's why it's driving parent demand here. So people get very confused about that. How do we fix it? Well, let's tell the truth to Plex. One of two things is going to happen, right? We're either going to make this job early or we're going to ship late, because in reality, we cannot ship something out on Monday that hasn't been made until Wednesday. And once I make those changes and I regenerate MRP and I've got the system set up, it will tell me now that I do not need that parent demand anymore because I've actually made a job to fulfill it. We're going to go back to 8 weeks here so we can actually see it in person here. And that parent demand should now be gone once it generates. So this parent demand here should go away. Hardest part about testing MRP is waiting for it to gen every time. Well, there we go. And now my parent demand for those pieces is gone because my job's going to be done in time. So hopefully that should help explain where that net demand comes from. Next up is a really important setting called inventory finished goods use. This setting shows up on a report that we're going to see a little bit. And generally, I hate reading slides to people, but this one is really important that we're all on the same page. So let's imagine that you have a job for 1,000 pieces. It's got 2 operations. The job's due in the week of April 27th, and the first op has 300 pieces through it, and op 20 hasn't started yet. So this setting says, how do you want to consider those 300 pieces in your net calculation? Do you want to see them in inventory now and the remaining 700 when the job's available 427? Or do you want to see nothing in inventory and see 1,000 available the week of 427? So remember, we can break down inventory into WIP versus finished goods as well. We saw that a little earlier, and the inventory is going to show either way. But if WIP isn't splitting out, this can be really confusing. So let's take a little deeper look into this. The next screen here says we've got 300 pieces in WIP. This is with the setting off, 300 pieces in WIP, and my scheduled shows the remaining 700 pieces. But yet with the setting on, there's still 300 in WIP, but I'm going to get 1,000, the entire job down here. Now notice each one has the same result of 1,000 at the net. But imagine if this was just one column and all you had was inventory, and it said 300 plus 1,000 equals 1,000, it would be really confusing. So we want to make sure that you understand what the setting is, why it's used, and how you want to use it for yourself. So a couple of more advanced PRP concepts. Multi-outs are another issue that could be a complete session on its own. So I'm just going to cover some of the more simple multi-out concepts and show you how some things can be accomplished with PRP on these. Now, most companies either use dynamic multi-outs or fixed multi-outs. Most companies don't use both, but some do. So let's start with the difference between dynamic and fixed multi-outs. Dynamic multi-outs are where you simply load up more than one job in Control Panel, and Plex creates a multi-out record in the background. These really aren't impacted at all by PRP because you can just create jobs as usual and load them up and run them. But fixed multi-outs are where you have a relationship between parts that happens regularly, like having one smash of a tool make a left and a right door hinge. So that's a fixed multi-out, and we can set those up so Plex can look at it in different ways. With a fixed multi-out, you create both output parts and then you define the multi-out. Now, there are a lot of different ways to create and use these. So if you're interested in the multi-out topic, let me know, but I'll wet your whistle a little bit with some of the things that we do to make things easier. There's a lot of settings to consider with multi-outs and different ways you can make them behave. So again, if you're interested in a session, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to go over a couple of quick MO settings on the next page. Going through these settings, it seems like a lot of they're very verbose and very wordy, but they're going to let you filter by a fixed multi-out. So let's say, for example, you want to know what's your PRP requirements for a specific set of tooling that makes it a left and a right hinge. You can actually filter by the parent part, and you can actually tell Plex whether or not you want to work with the parent part or the child parts. So we're going to go into our PCN here, and we're going to look at one of the child parts of the parent parts that I have set up here. So I've got a molded left part and a molded right part that comes out of the same tooling. And it comes out of a parent part that we call molded operation 10. So this is the actual multi-out relationship here. And these are my process routings. So you can see on the process routings here that we create this molded parent, and it makes a left and a right, and the left and the right actually consumes the parent. So this works really well for this particular configuration. Now, if I look at PRP for my parent part of molded operation 10, you can see I've got some demand in here, some very random demand. And if I want to create a job for this, normally if I click on this 1000, I would expect Plex to create a job for 1000 of the molded lefts. But Plex knows, hey, when I make a molded left, I'm actually making a parent job here. So it's going to make lefts and rights. Now I'm going to put a real goofy number in here so it sticks out like a sore thumb. And the way my system is configured now is this is going to create 3 different jobs. One for the molded parent, and then 1 each for the subsequent operations of the child. So it's created 3 jobs here. And we know that we're going to end up with 9,999 more child parts here. So again, multi-outs, they can be their own session. There's a lot to consider, but this is kind of a fun one to do. Forecast module, again, could also be a class on its own, so we're just going to touch on it. There's a couple different forecast integration methods, and since you can have multiple forecasts, you have to decide which ones are going to interact with PRP and MRP and how. Now, please note this is not the release type of forecast that I'm speaking of. It's the actual forecast module. It can be pretty easy to mess it up if you're not careful. I always say there's only 2 types of forecasts, lucky and wrong. And you have to be careful, because what if you get a forecast from each customer and you either forget to add them all together or you forget to mark them all for MRP? So let's go into Plex Live here, and let's first talk about the forecast, sales forecast. This is what I mean by the sales forecast, not a customer release type that's called forecast. And I've told Plex that I'm going to need 500 of my molded right component in November and December. And when I look at MRP here, we can see that here's my November forecast and here's my December forecast, and it is consuming inventory because that's what I've told it to do. Now, to update this, it's pretty simple. I'll change the numbers in here by clicking on this, and I'm going to change my forecast. Instead of to be 500, I'm going to change my forecast to be 1,500 each, just because that'll be nice and easy. And I'm going to click OK. Now, when I do that, nothing changes in Plex here. I still only see 500 because I have to tell Plex, oh, let's push this forecast version, which is this version here. I'm going to push it up to MRP. And Plex will give me a warning saying this is a long process. Now, honestly, I haven't noticed that it's very long, but it does happen pretty quick. This is my default forecast, and it is the one that's flagged for MRP. You'll notice my weekly one is not flagged for MRP. If I had a weekly forecast and a monthly forecast, and I pushed them both in MRP, I would be in danger of doubling my demand. So I've pushed this out to MRP. Let's take a peek at this and see if anything changed. Whoops, it didn't change. That's because I also have to generate my MRP. And when I get done generating this, we should actually see my 1,500 pieces of forecasting. So we'll wait for this to actually gen. I might go back to it in a few minutes if it's going to take a while. But so be careful not to double dip. Remember, you want to update MRP, then go to PRP and regen, and then the forecast is going to be up. And again, forecast and MRP could be a session in itself, so I can't get too deep into it, but just a couple warnings here. If you have more than one forecast integrating with MRP, make sure you don't send demand over twice, and make sure if you're getting EDI releases that are of a release type forecast, there's my 1,500 pieces there, that you aren't doubling that. And finally, if you're looking at netting your forecasts against your releases, make sure that you are testing for period stop and start, because a monthly forecast can work against weekly releases, and there's settings that'll say, hey, look, peanut butter this over the end of the month. So the long and short of it is that the system has methods of making sure the forecast and release don't double dip, but they're very dependent on exact setups such as forecast buckets, MRP buckets. If you're interested in a separate session, go ahead and let us know when we can put something together for another Control+M Presents. Next up, displaying customer releases second row. So this is super useful if you get EDI releases from your customers that are of a type forecast. So in essence, your customers communicating directly to you that they have a forecasted release amount. And Plex has a way to break this out in PRP. So it's a Plex only setting. So I'm going to show it to you in test. This is actually the setting. It's called customer releases second row net. So this is telling me, hey, if I put a second row in there, do I want to include it in the math? And with this answer, customer releases second row use, this asks me for which release types are going to be in that second row. So I'm telling Plex that I want to net them, and I want to use this key of 2108. Now, if you don't know how to find what that means, I'm going to bring up the setup table here. This is the customer release type setup table. And you can see my forecast release has a key of 2108. Now, if you don't know what the keys are, typically if you hover over them, you can see the primary value key at the top of your screen, or you can click maintenance on setup tables and you can tell Plex whether or not you want to show that key here. So I've told Plex, please net it, and please net the forecast type here. And when I click OK on this, we're going to see another I had already updated this, sorry. We're going to see another release in here called customer releases 2. And we'll see in here that we actually have a different type of release here. So in this case, my apple pie has my customer release of 24 and customer releases 2 is 10. Let's take a peek at those details again. This hyperlink takes you to all releases, and we'll see that we have a 24-piece ship schedule release and a 10-piece forecast. So it's putting it on its own line. So again, you can separate that in its own line, and you can include it in the math or not include it in the math. It's not a substitute for the forecast module. I will tell you that if you're using the forecast module, it is meant to be exported, imported, overwritten. It's super easy to use. So now that we've gone 900 miles an hour through these options, let's talk about how to make PRP behave. And that really starts with clean data. It's important.
Sorry, Patty.
Yes.
Patty, I'm sorry. Can you go back to that screen real quick with the settings for the custom release row number 2 so I can take a screenshot of that, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
I don't think I actually have them up here. Hold on a second to go back. And it's just go to PRP and look for settings manager and go to second row, and they're right there. Okay. Got them? Remember, this is going to be different for you than me. Got to look at the setup table to get that value.
Yeah.
Whatever
I got it. Okay. And I know that. Yep. Thank you.
Beautiful. All right. So clean data. It's really important to clean out old jobs and job ops when they're done. If you have old jobs in your system, Plex can't help but think you're still going to make them. And it's possible that they might require components or subassemblies. Imagine this: if you have a job for 1,000 pieces of something out there and you only were able to make 990, if you don't close the job, Plex is going to still see that job out there for 10 pieces. And if any of the operations that are not closed require BOM components, Plex is going to assume that you need those. It's going to drive those demand through. So make sure you clean up those old data, and you can use things like job bulk update, job mass update, or you can even close ops on the dispatch list. So remember to manage this regularly because it does impact a number of areas. Same thing with partial shipments to customers. So if your customer orders 1,000 parts and you ship 990 and you're not set to close on a threshold, that release for 10 pieces is still out there. So if you have no intention or no ability to ship against that, take the time to close it. Look at the screen called Customer Releases Mass Edit. Similar to MRP, the report called the MRP diagnostics report is really very useful. It's going to help you to clean up errors in there. Some are bigger errors than others. For example, active and unused parts might not be a big deal if you are in a situation where you're replicating parts to all your PCNs. But if you do have a lot of active and unused parts and you're not in a multiple PCN configuration, you might want to clean it up. Started jobs without active containers are a great way to show where we might have open operations that are not going to be made. And finally, there's a section on here called active parts without shippable ops, which typically means there's no routing step at all. The report is pretty awesome. Here's how it looks in UX. So take the time to look at the report called MRP Diagnostics. And you can control some filters in here. For example, if you are part replicating, you're not going to care about the active parts in there. But one of the most important ones here is active parts with multiple material operations. Those will double drive MRP components. And actually, right after our session last week, we had a customer call that actually found that condition, multiple material components, because it double drives. This is what it looks like in Classic. Now notice that this inventory finished goods use looks like an error. Now, I personally don't think of it as an error because of how we saw it working in the earlier slide. I think of it as like a style choice. So now that you know how it works, you decide again. So it's a pretty cool report. There's some other fun reports to dig into. Parts with invalid operations is one we always use when we're taking a customer live because it shows parts that are missing work centers or suppliers, or even missing an entire routing. There's also a report, I think in Classic, it's called Customer Release Change Sales. In UX, it's Customer Release Change Report, or the Customer Demand Waterfall Report, which is helpful for EDI. That focuses on changes in orders that are coming in automatically. And Plex also does have subcontract requirements planning, but that would have to be a different session because, as you can see, we barely are making it through PRP in an hour or so. So longer term to review, get everybody in a room and have them agree on what is demand, what is inventory, what is lead time, are our min inventories accurate, and are we doubling up or tripling out those minimum inventories? And remember that your differing functions have different goals because ops always wants to have components and subassemblies, and accounting always wants cash flow. So get everyone into a room together and come to the best conclusion for the team. Get everybody involved in this, and make sure you see how your changes identify key metrics like on-time delivery and cash flow. Remember, Plex is just a tool that you use to run your business. So start with your business needs and then back into the MRP settings. And when you begin to implement changes, make sure that you are testing, test, and make sure it's not just you doing the testing. I want you to share the testing love. Have the people that use MRP and use PRP be involved in the testing, because if they trust it and they have faith in it, they're going to definitely believe in it much more. So a couple slides of troubleshooting. When you're first starting out, use a simple part and start clean. Use big quantities and put your demands out in the future, because when everything is piled up in the past due column, it gets ugly to see. Sometimes it's even best if you go into test and create a brand new fake part and make it nice and clean, because diagnosing one part number at a time is easiest and you're going to get very good at it very quickly. Again, try to avoid past due numbers when you're learning, because that can be hard, especially if you have super long lead times. So if you're using an existing part, you might want to manipulate those in tests so you can actually see them in daily buckets. And again, regarding past due, parent demand and net demand still behave the same way. We just analyzed one last week where it's October 19th. Customer had a customer order due on the 15th and a job due on September 25th. But it's October 19th, and Plex was still throwing double demand because it's saying, hey, look, even though it's past due, the job won't be done before the order is supposed to ship. So it's throwing demand for both of them, even though they're both in the past, because we can't ship on the 25th and we can't build on the 15th or vice versa. So we want to make sure that we generate MRP between changes, we understand it, and we're careful about past due. Once you have mastered the simple script, then you can get into the tougher parts. Just don't try to eat the whole elephant in one sitting. Start with a random recommendation and focus on a single BOM item, whether it's a subassembly or a component, and work backwards until you understand. If you're looking in MRP, make sure you look from MRP, then back to PRP to explain, because remember those standard job quantities of 15 and min inventory of 10? And when I looked at the demand, it said it was a min inventory of 15. That is a little bit murky, and it will only get more murky through MRP. So go from MRP to PRP and then diagnose back that way. Once you've figured out one BOM item, pick a next and keep selecting the next one till you can work it all backwards. Now, look, it can be tough to diagnose in the real world where you've got more than one part using raw material or subassembly, combination of parent and net demand, and then you add the complexities of min inventory and scrap. So I like to sit down on a piece of paper and write down the parts I'm looking at. What's my lead time? What's my min inventory, standard job quantity? What are all these things? So when I'm diagnosing MRP and PRP, if I get stuck, I can just look at that page and go, oh yeah, even though min inventory is 10, standard quantity is 15. So it's going to drive everything into multiples of 15. So I always start by, if I get really stuck, go into test, kill all the inventory, kill all the jobs, kill all the orders, regen, and make it clean. Then add an order, regen, make sure you understand it. Add a job, regen, make sure you understand it. So that's typically the best way to troubleshoot. Now, I want everyone to email me directly, Patty at Control+M Solutions, or Jill, who linked you here, if you've got questions or if you want to see some of these other sessions. And I'm going to open up the floor to questions while I show you what our next session is going to be on, and remind you that if you do have questions, you have to unmute yourself. So what questions have you got for me? Does everybody love MRP now and PRP?
So I had the same question that I asked the run start date use. It seems like in our system, when we use finite, it takes the job operation start date into account for the parent demand. And if it finite reschedules the start date to something further out because we don't have material, it seems like it's putting parent demand and job demand in the PRP.
Yeah, there might be a way that you want to set up your is this for multi-outs, right?
No, not for multi-outs, but we have multiple levels of parts.
Oh, sub-assemblies?
Yeah.
Okay. You might consider using job sets for those, because I believe finite scheduling can be, I know it has a batch functionality where it can move jobs in batch that uses for nesting, but Jeff, if you want to reach out, I'll take that as a question for potentially having finite move job sets together, because I can see how that would happen. It would throw parent demand if it moved the one.
Correct. Yeah. Yep. Okay.
What other questions we got? Everyone's pretty cool. Everyone loves MRP and PRP now. Okay, I'll tell you what, I'm pretty sure you will have some questions. Let's talk about our next session. Jen Berry's going to cover BOM depletion units. So this is most useful in food and beverage, but if you buy flour in 50-pound bags and you consume it 12 ounces to a recipe, you wouldn't want to say I want 0.015 of a 50-pound bag. So Jen's going to show how to use depletion units. And we won't be meeting until November 9th. We got a couple of go lives. In fact, I think we have 4 go lives yet before the end of the year, which will bring us up to 20 for the year. So it's a busy couple weeks. Looking forward to seeing you then. I hope you have enjoyed the session. Thanks, and I will have it up on the YouTube either today or tomorrow.